nothing in our Constitution, even remotely suggesting that government should be involved in the redistribution of income. Of course, there was no income tax until the amendment in 1913. Actually, there were some temporary income taxes during wars, but they were ruled unconstitutional later by the Supreme Court. So there weren't taxes. There was no notion that the purpose of government was to take care of the economic needs of the people. We were to be free, which was a whole lot better than what the situation was in the old world, and then use our freedom to find ways to prosper. It was what we call a private property order. It was based on private property. The politics is what we call, in economics, there's a distinction between the normative and the positive. The normative is what we should do. The positive describes how the world really works. And as much as politicians like to flatter themselves that they can bend reality to conform with their desires, that's just not so. Politicians cannot revise the laws of physics. They can't revise the laws of chemistry. They can't revise the principles of engineering, and they can't revise the principles of economics. These are givens. These are things we just have to learn to live with and maybe harness them for our benefit, but we can't change them. That reminds me of the story. There was something I was going to tell you at the end of the last lecture, and questions were coming in, and it slipped my mind. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian novelist who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was a Russian patriot serving faithfully in the Russian army in World War II, committed the indiscretion of writing home and saying Stalin's strategy wasn't very good. His mail was read, there was no privacy, no individual rights or anything like that. And he was sent to a labor camp, 10-year sentence, served 8 years, then Stalin died and they let Solzhenitsyn out. But in the Gulag Archipelago, which was his nonfiction, he won the Nobel Prize for some novels he wrote, but he wrote nonfiction also. And he tells the story there of the socialist central planners wanted to increase the shipment of some kind of ore from one part of the Soviet Union, hundreds or maybe thousands of miles away across that vast expanse of land. They called in a couple of engineers just to consult. And the engineers said, well, comrades, you won't be able to do this because the tracks that go across that part of the country, there's a stress factor involved. They can only sustain so much weight. And you're proposing to ship more weight than those tracks were designed to support. Well, the socialist planners did not like being told what they could and could not do, even though this wasn't an opinion. This was the statement of scientific, technological fact. The politicians sent those engineers outside and had them shot by a firing squad as saboteurs because they weren't going with the great socialist plan. They then proceeded to load up the trains with heavier loads, and guess what? The tracks broke down, and so instead of getting more of what was needed to its intended location, they ended up getting less. That's the kind of bad stuff that happens when you try to cheat the laws of nature, and that can include the laws of economics. There's something important I want to tell you about Mises' economics. It was what he calls wertfrei. I've got that written down here. Okay. Wertfrei is with the W there. It's a German word that means value free. Sorry, my R's are kind of goofy. Wertfrei. Because Mises wanted economics to be a science. There's cause, there's effect. Now, you can't always predict the effects in human society from one cause because there are many causes, many factors, many variables, so that even if one thing is going on, it can get outweighed by other factors. So you can't quantify things strictly. But he was trying to find a wertfrei, a value-free economics. That would make it worthy of being called a science. That's not to say that humans are value-free. Mises would never believe that. He knows that we act in accordance with our values, not only our economic values, but our ethical values. Of course, that's what being human is making these important choices based on our values. But pure economic analysis would be value-free. And a lot of people in the conservative movement, especially Christians, have had a hard time with that. And I addressed this question. If you're interested at all, I think it's one of the better articles I've ever written. Sorry, that doesn't sound very modest. But about a quarter of a century ago, I wrote an article for the Acton Institute called Misesian, that's Mises with an IAN at the end of it, Misesian Economics in the Bible. And I explained why what I thought Mises accomplished with his theory of praxeology and developing a coherent, workable theory of economics, I thought it was one of the most outstanding intellectual contributions ever, because it dovetailed neatly with Moses. You know, Moses and Mises both taught the same thing, and that is, I mean, one thing that they taught of many, but especially Moses. But Moses gave us the word of God. He gave us the Decalogue, and the 8th commandment is, thou shalt not steal. That's a pretty powerful, blunt endorsement of private property. Doesn't say thou shalt not steal except by majority vote. It says you don't steal. Somebody's property is their property. And what else did Moses say of the commandments? Do these things and you'll be blessed. Follow these commandments. It's good for you. So one of the things that is good for human society is to respect private property. Mises, with his very fine, value-free economic analysis, came to the identical conclusion. If you want a society to attain its maximum potential for prosperity, you must, not, it would be nice if you did this, you must respect private property. Private property was the foundation on which economically rational prices could be formed and from which profitability could then be computed. You know, the Marxists tried to badmouth profits. You know, oh, those are evil things. It's unnecessary surplus wealth being siphoned off by those greedy capitalists. Profits are the source of new wealth. Think about it. You're an entrepreneur. You get this idea for a new service or a new product. You pay X dollars for your various factors of production, your labor, your capital, your resources, your equipment, etc. Say you invest $1 million and you hope to make your money back and start showing a profit several years down the road. Well, if you do, in fact, succeed in selling to voluntary buyers enough so that you generate that kind of revenue to turn a profit, then you've succeeded. If not, you've destroyed wealth. The profits of the business represent new wealth. The only way we have defeated, that we've made so much tremendous progress against poverty, rolling back the incidence of poverty, that horrible curse that afflicted the majority of human beings who have ever lived. And now we've got a tiny minority. By the way, I think today is the day that the 8 billionth person arrived on Earth. 8 billion human beings alive 2 centuries ago would have been an utter impossibility, because there wasn't the means to produce enough wealth to sustain that much human life. But contrary to what the gloom and doom environmentalists, the Greens, say about humans being a scourge on the earth, more humans, we found more ways to work together to produce more wealth, more profits, more new wealth, so that our standards of living have been rising even as the population's been rising. This is fantastic. And it's been primarily possible by our respect for private property. Tell you something else about Mises, it's very important. He refuted what is called the Montaigne dogma. Michel de Montaigne was a philosopher in the 1600s. And I've got a quote from him he basically sounded the philosophical keynote for the age of mercantilism, roughly 1500 to 1800, when capitalism supplanted it. The Montaigne dogma, as Mises refers to it, this is a almost universally accepted teaching. Quote, no profit whatever can possibly be made but at the expense of another. This was that infamous zero-sum view of the world. If I gain in an interaction with you, it means you lost, or vice versa. You win, I lose, but there's no net gain. That's not how the world works in a world of private property, where people are free to exchange or not exchange their property. When do you exchange your property? When you can get something in exchange for it that you value more. You've profited. But why would the other person trade it, what he's giving to you? Because he values what you have and what he gets from you. So the world really is positive sum. We keep enriching each other through our voluntary exchanges. It can be a very slow process, and some of these gains are microscopic, like when you buy a box of cereal for breakfast, but it keeps you going. But the overall net effect of free markets with voluntary exchanges and private property is that wealth constantly increases. And we've seen that to be the case. Sadly, Mises made a comment, this Montaigne dogma also pertains to international affairs, not just like a local or national economy. Mises wrote, as long as the people cling to the Montaigne dogma and think that they cannot prosper economically except at the expense of other nations, peace will never be anything other than a period of preparation for the next war. And indeed, war has been the tragic history of the human race. And yet, since World War II, the incidence of war has declined. We don't see it because we're kind of the world's policemen. We get involved in skirmishes. We do hear about coups in other countries and so on and so forth. But the pace of war has declined noticeably in the last 70 years. Look at the French and the Germans. For generations, they were trying to exterminate each other. Now they have an open border between the two countries, and they share a common currency. They're having so much fun peacefully coexisting with each other and engaging in prosperous, mutually beneficial commerce. They're not interested in fighting each other. Sadly, we have a couple of throwbacks. Putin, Xi in China. Those guys are still thinking like it's the 19th century, and the only way a great power can increase its standing in the world is to conquer another country. And there's really no excuse for China feeling that way. They've benefited colossally from peaceful trade the last 40 years. Why do they want to get belligerent now? It's really a human tragedy. But Mises exploded the Montaigne dogma. And we realize now that the average person and the average society, we're all better off if we engage in positive sum economic activity, which means voluntary exchange, which means each person's property rights are secure and they only give up their property when they're receiving something of greater value in return. And it's mutually beneficial to both sides. That's a far more wholesome, healthy, productive, and truly progressive way of humans interacting with each other than the old Montaigne dogma, which is what I got to take something from you and hurt you so I can get ahead. Absolutely tragic that people believe that for a long time. Okay, we just had an election, but let's do a quick look at our history. I said that our Constitution was set up in a way that confined the federal government to very few functions, none of which really directly was involved in supporting us financially, taking care of our economic needs. We were on our own, but we were free, which is a huge advantage over the old world. I had an article this last 4th of July in the Epoch Times. I'll just share a few points of it with you, where I compare the American philosophy with what I call alien philosophies, old world philosophies, backwards looking philosophies, whatever. So what did our founders think? What was the United States of America all about? What was the role of politics? What was the role of government? What was the purpose of government? Well, first of all, one of our principles in America is that law should be predominantly negative. Negative in the sense of just preventing us from doing bad things to other people. You know, don't steal, don't kill, don't rob, don't rape, don't cheat on contracts. Because you see, most governments believe in positive laws, positive in the sense of this is what you must do. But you see, once a government starts telling people what they're supposed to do with their lives, those aren't free people anymore. They're the serfs or the slaves or the robot, whatever, the automatons at the service of the state. That's not America. So law should be negative. It's like the 10 Commandments. You know, don't do this, don't do that for the most part. Gospel says do this. But Jesus never said this should be enforced by government. This is between you and God. If the Spirit moves you to give to your fellow man, hey, God bless you. But it's not your fellow man's, it's not government's role to tell you how much you're supposed to do for your fellow man. That's between you and the Creator. Second aspect of Americanism, that the purpose of government in our economic life is to act as an impartial umpire, the night watchman. Keep the playing field level. Don't let somebody cheat from somebody else. But certainly not for our government to pick economic winners and losers. That's the old world way. That's playing favorites. No, our government is supposed to be an impartial umpire. Third belief, Americans believe that rights of individuals are primary and the powers of government are secondary. And that was truly revolutionary, probably still is today. The proof of that is in the 9th and the 10th Amendments. The 9th Amendment is about rights. It says that any right that isn't specifically mentioned in the Constitution, we assume that people have that right. And the 10th Amendment is about government power. And it says that any government power that's not explicitly given to the government by the Constitution, the assumption is that the government does not have that power. So whenever the question is in doubt between whether an individual has a right or government has power over individuals, the individual right is primary. Americanism upholds private property. It's kind of repeating what I've said about our economics. We uphold voluntary economic exchange as a fundamental human right. Fifth point, Americanism says that the right and legitimate way for individuals to prosper is to earn a living by providing something of value for others. Nobody's going to give you a free ride in this world. You need to work. And in our social division of labor, a lot of times the way to make money is to specialize in something you're really good at and deliver that service or the good that you produce to others. And then they'll pay you for it, and you'll prosper. It's kind of almost like the golden rule. You know, do unto others. Work hard in service to others. That's how you make money. The sixth point, we all know this one from the Declaration of Independence, is that we affirm that all humans are created equal in the eyes of God. And because of that, everyone's entitled to receive equal legal and governmental protection of their rights. Most of the countries of the world, their governments have a system of privileges. But the American system was, no, we have equal rights. We have equal opportunity. Now that's been warped over the years. We practice cronyism. And we have people that think that we should all be equal in results, the socialists. But the original American vision was that all men are created equal in the eyes of God, and we all deserve equal legal and governmental protection. And obviously, the Black race was excluded from that, to our shame, but we've corrected it. And I love what Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence. We know about, our God-given unalienable rights. But farther down, Jefferson writes this, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, in other words, the end of securing citizens' God-given rights, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. In other words, the American concept of government is that government serves the people, not the people serve the government. That's what's so revolutionary about the American system. So to boil it down into a couple of words, the American philosophy was liberty, and the other alien philosophies all tend toward tyranny. It's a pretty fundamental choice there. Great country. We were in line with some of the great philosophers, our country's vision. For example, Adam Smith. I mentioned him a month ago, the author of An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was by far the most influential economic treatise of the 18th and perhaps the 19th century. But Smith, as I told you a month ago, was a moral philosopher. And 17 years before he published The Wealth of Nations, he published a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He's a moral philosopher. He wrote about moral sentiments. And he had a view of what the primary social virtues were that dovetailed neatly with our founding fathers' view of things. The three primary social virtues, according to Adam Smith. The first one is prudence. Prudence is taking care of yourself and your family if you have people dependent on you. And why is that a social virtue? Well, so you don't become a burden on somebody else. So the first social virtue is prudence. Take care of yourself. You're responsible for yourself. The second social virtue is justice. And that's what we were just talking about, thou shalt not. Don't do bad things to anybody else. As Frédéric Bastiat, the brilliant French writer, economic journalist of the writing in the late 1840s wrote, justice, it's in an essay called The Law, and it's about 75 pages, and you can probably skip 20 pages of it when he starts talking about 19th century French politicians that you and I have never heard of. But there's such great eloquence there. You can get that free online if you're interested. The Law by Frédéric Bastiat, B-A-S-T-I-A-T. B-A-S-T-I-A-T, Frédéric Bastiat. And his definition of justice was, justice is when there is no injustice. I mean, it's kind of like a negative definition, but how can you say when justice is reigning? It's when nobody's rights are being violated. It's when there's no practice of injustice. You respect people's rights, you do not violate their rights. You do not commit injustice, then you have justice. So Smith said that justice was the absolute most important of the three virtues, absolutely essential to the survival of a stable society. Because once government or powerful individuals start trampling on the rights of others, seizing their property, appropriating their property through taxation for various things other than just the common welfare, like the roads and the post office. Once you've undercut justice, you lose the cohesion that holds a society together. The members of society assume an adversary attitude toward each other. The other person is a threat, whereas in a law-abiding society where everybody's rights are honored and respected and upheld, by the police and the laws of the land, you have harmony. You have people getting along together peacefully. So to undercut justice is to erode the foundations of a stable society. Smith's third cardinal virtue was benevolence. And this is a Christian quality. Do good for others. He said that is the crowning achievement of a great society, but, very important but here, you cannot compel charity or benevolence. It has to be voluntary. Because if you take it upon yourself to appropriate a certain amount of your fellow citizens' wealth because you want to give it to that business there, or those poor people there, or the farmers, or whatever the special interest group is, once you've done that, you've violated the prior principle of justice. So in order for benevolence to be compatible with justice, benevolence has to be voluntary. You can't trample somebody else's rights just because you want to be generous with somebody else's money, which, as you can see, is kind of a fakey sort of charity at that. So that was the founders' view. We're not like that anymore. I just happened to notice today, I was stunned. I thought we were up to about 6 trillion. I looked at a federal government website just a couple hours ago. The federal government, it says itself, is planning to spend $7.75 trillion this year. I think it took from 1789, the first year of the American Republic, to 1850, about 6 decades, for us to spend our first $1 billion. Heck, our federal Uncle Sam goes through $1 billion every hour or two now. I haven't calculated what it is, but it's ridiculous. Pardon me if you're already familiar with this, but I think some of you might not have. Let me try to convey to you the magnitude of trillion. Now, it's a simple word. We just toss these words. Oh, it used to be billions. Now, Everett Dirksen used to say, he was a senator from Illinois 60 years ago, a billion here, a billion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. Well, now it's a trillion here, a trillion there. Maybe he said it's a million here, a million, I don't know. But here's the scale. If you had $100 bills, brand new crisp flat ones, and you had them in a stack where they're flat on top of each other, a stack about 40 inches high, say up to your waist or your rib cage or whatever, that's $1 million. $1 billion would be a stack that's almost twice as tall as the Empire State Building. $1 trillion would be almost 630 miles. A million is 40 inches. $1 trillion is about 630 miles. We're 31 trillion in debt. These numbers are unfathomable. So obviously, this government's gotten bigger. Why? Because people wanted it bigger. It's a democratic system. I mean, it's a republic, but it's democratic in nature, and people had the idea that government should do more, especially politicians. They can be very popular, and they can win votes in popularity contests by doing more. This was the philosophy of progressivism, that the government should progressively grow, progressively do more and more to support the American people and businesses economically. There was a man who taught history at Grove City College briefly in the late 60s named Clarence B. Carson. A couple of his books are free online. The Flight from Reality, I think, maybe. Carson coined the term meliorism. In Latin, good is bonum, melior is better, optimum is best, okay? It's the root of our verb ameliorate, to make better, M-E-L-I-O-R, meliorism. The doctrine that government should make life better for people. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is it puts you on a slippery slope. In other words, if you're going to help farmers, then why not help teachers or accountants or whatever? You know, if you're going to help this group, why not help that group? If you're going to give them a raise, why not give the other ones a raise? It's a slippery slope. And for decades, I've been writing about the bigger government party, the Democrats. You ask them, well, how big do you want the government to get? They'd never tell you what the limit was. They had a very simple campaign slogan: more. We want to increase government payments. Which, of course, since government doesn't produce any wealth of its own, means we want to increase the amount of wealth we extract from private citizens. That sets up a lot of stress in your society. That sets up a class warfare between the tax consumers and the taxpayers. But it's very effective politics. It's not good economics. Nobody can convince me that being $31 trillion in debt with our government, that's a good thing. It hasn't mattered yet, but someday it'll matter, and we won't like it when it happens. But that's the progressive idea: more, more, more. And so ameliorism, eventually it became, well, we've got to help everybody. So it's got to be perfectionism, it's got to be utopianism, it's got to be socialism. In other words, it's got to be tyranny. Because the only way that the government can be in a position where they claim to be taking care of everybody is to have control over all the wealth of the country. So progressivism was the slippery slope that took the United States of America from the limited free market system of our founders in the first few generations, and through steady, well, lurch back and forth, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but progressive growth of government, so that we've ended up where we are today, with government being involved in energy, education, agriculture, transportation, healthcare, housing, retirement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Government's worked its way into every aspect of our life. I wrote an article earlier this year, all politics all the time. I've had so many friends lament, it used to be, you'd talk about politics near an election, but it would never come up otherwise. These days, it seems to come up year round. Well, yeah, because government's always there. It's in your face, wherever it is. It's quite a change. Got a trivia question for you, history trivia question. 1820, James Monroe, running for re-election to the presidency. He's worth reading about. Pretty neat guy, James Monroe. Any of you remember who his opponent was? It's a trick question. He didn't have one. Back then, the federal government had a very simple job: defend us if we're attacked by foreigners, make sure we have a system of courts and laws so everybody can get a fair trial, deliver the mail. It's a pretty simple job. Nobody bothered running against them. It was like, what's the point? Nothing's going to change. We're going to be just as free. I mean, now can you imagine an election that's uncontested? Of course not. Uncle Sam Malone's fighting over who gets to spend over $7 trillion a year. That's a lot of financial incentive to get politically active and politically aggressive. And that kind of explains where we are today. And so many of our young people are attracted to socialism. And at the root of it, I think, for most of them at least, I think there's a kind, benign impulse. What they haven't learned yet is it's one thing to desire a certain goal. And I think what a lot of these people want is an eradication of poverty. Confession: I was a socialist when I was an undergraduate. The experience that pushed me over the edge was I was studying in Colombia, South America, 19 years old. In the first couple of weeks I was there, I noticed these clusters of street urchins on the sidewalks of the capital city of Bogota. And in every one of these groups, and they might be 15, a dozen, 15 little kids, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. And in every group, one or two of them, there was a kid on a crutch because he was missing a foot. And I'm looking around and there's no trolleys or, there's no train tracks. It's like, where are these kids getting their foot? How are they losing their feet? I asked one of my professors, and then I learned the heartbreaking truth. Parents would lop off the foot of a child before abandoning it to a gang on the streets because they felt that a maimed child would be more likely to receive handouts than a whole child. I mean, that kind of poverty, I'd never dreamt of that growing up in a middle-class suburb of Detroit. That never occurred to me. Oh my gosh. I became a socialist. I wanted so badly to wipe out that kind of poverty. Now I'm an anti-socialist, but guess what? I still hate poverty. I still want to wipe it out. The difference is an intellectual thing. The feelings come first. I understand the passion that these young people have to want to eradicate the blight of poverty. That's a worthy goal. But it takes wisdom and intelligence and understanding of how the world works. And this is where economics comes in. Economics teaches how the world works economically in terms of wealth creation, wealth expansion, prosperity, and so forth. We have to understand economics to make sure we adopt the right policies that best promote the production of additional wealth. Because after all, the antidote for poverty is wealth. But wealth doesn't grow on trees, it has to be produced. And so I gave up I guess this is why I'm a conservative rather than a radical. I realized, as much as I would love there to be a switch that we could just flip up, bingo, poverty's gone, hooray, hooray. There is no such switch. But it's the free market that has led to the prosperity that has so blessed the world. I mentioned earlier that the 8 billionth person appeared on Earth today. We're up to 8 billion. In the 70s, we had 3.5 billion people in the world, and 2 billion of them were poor, more than 50% of the human race. Now we've got 8 billion, and fewer than 1 billion are poor. I'm really sorry, there are still poor people, but there always will be, as long as you have like a Maduro down in Venezuela. Human beings have an amazing capacity to goof things up, and he's goofing them up royal by adopting socialism and basically collapsing the entire Venezuelan economy, leaving those people without basic needs. He's impoverished them through socialism. Socialism isn't the cure, socialism is the curse. The market economy is why we have fewer than half as many poor people in the world today as we did in the 70s, even though the population has more than doubled since the 70s. That's tremendous progress. And it's one of my pet peeves that we have people who keep ripping on the United States as some awful place because we don't have nirvana. We haven't achieved perfection. We haven't demonstrated heaven on earth. But let's have some perspective, folks. When I was a college kid in the 60s and the 70s, what were the issues? Well, we were concerned about war. We were concerned about poverty. We were concerned about racism. We were concerned about pollution. Fast forward to today, half a century later or so. There's a lot less pollution. Is there pollution? Yeah. And we have to continue addressing it, but there's less. We've made progress. Are there still some racist individuals? Yes. But widespread racism? I'm sorry, it's diminished greatly. I mean, I'm not sorry, I'm glad. Poverty. The average poor person in America today has a higher standard of living than I had as a middle-class kid in the 50s. So what did I say? Pollution, war. Not as much war in the world. So it's like, are we perfect? No. Are we heading in the right direction? I think so. maybe not on every front, but I mean, it shows that we as Americans have a great capacity to rise to the challenges of each generation and make progress. And so what I'm hoping, I don't know, I want to write an open letter to these kids that are socialists and say, you know, think about it. Do you really want to do this? I mean, because what happens in the practice of socialism, socialism advertises itself as being democratic. It's highly undemocratic, because once you get the Socialist Party in power, the political elites take over big sections of the economy. There's such a power imbalance. See, Mises praised the private market as a system he described as consumer sovereignty. The consumer was the boss. Businesses competed with each other to see who could best serve the needs of the consumer. The consumer is just sitting back there letting these different businesses knock themselves out to make better goods for them. You know, as Joseph Schumpeter said, I'm sorry if I said this last time, but it's one of my favorites. He said, oh my goodness, he said, you know, the role of the capitalist is not to make more silk stockings for queens, is to make more and more silk stockings at lesser and lesser cost so the shop girls can wear them. So that people can afford more, they can buy more with less. That's what consumer sovereignty is. Socialism throws out the consumer. It says, no, we don't want businesses producing what you consumers want. We want them producing what we, the state, want, because we have a great plan, you know, like the Green New Deal, where we're going to rebuild all the houses and vehicles and buildings in this country and use renewable energy to do it. Right. We talk about, I mean, that's a more ambitious program than any pharaoh had with their pyramid building projects back then. That's what Mises calls a command system that those people are pushing for. So I don't think, I mean, I'm hoping young people realize, wait a minute, I don't want to end up being a dictator, because socialism is anti-democratic. It is elitist, and ultimately it is tyrannical, because it centralizes so much power. All the key economic decisions are made by just a few people. I had a few other thoughts that I don't think I'll save them for the future, but you know, we're most of the way to socialism today, and we can see that in the cronyism that is so widespread. You know, in a free market, it's the sovereign consumer that picks the economic winners and the economic losers. In socialism, it's the government that says, oh, no, this is what we have to produce, so these are the winners. Well, guess what? Cronyism, that's government. You know, some people say crony capitalism. That's like liquid ice. It's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as crony capitalism. Cronyism is half the way to socialism. It's the government picking winners and losers. And bureaucratism. Mises' book, Bureaucracy, 144 pages. So that's free online. The bureaucratic model is essentially a glimpse of socialism. Let's look at the Pentagon. You know, the left says, well, the Pentagon is this wasteful bureaucracy, let's dismantle it. I say, well, wait a minute, we've got to have national defense, okay? But I'll agree with you, it's wasteful, because bureaucracies don't operate on a profit and loss system like private businesses do. They just siphon money out of the federal treasury to do what they do. And they do it poorly, they do it inefficiently, but at least it gets done. The moral that we should draw, the lesson we should learn from the inefficiencies of the Pentagon is not to abolish national defense. That doesn't make sense. It's to not have so many federal bureaucracies. Socialism is a system of complete, utter bureaucratic management. It's total bureaucracy. We're not there yet. We're getting there. We have too many, dozens of bureaucracies. I was looking today at the duplication we have. See if I can follow up a couple of, well, it's like we have 80 programs teaching people how to be better teachers. I don't know, maybe we should get a refund on that one. 120 bureaus that support technological research, and on and on and on. We've gone too far down that road. The market, a century ago, before all these government bureaucracies got up and rolling, there was an explosion of inventiveness and new products coming to market, standards of living rising. It wasn't because of government propping things up, picking winners and losers, or bureaucratic management. It was simply entrepreneurs taking advantage of a free market system and doing wonderful things for us. Okay, golly, there are a couple issues I didn't get to. I left out a few historical points. I was going to revisit our friend Keynes, but I'll take a little break from him. And I thought as a present day issue, this whole thing of student loans and higher education. These are things we can talk about in the next lecture, or maybe the next lecture, it might be time to start talking about money and inflation, because that's been such a pressing issue this year. So let's see, I've got 8:24. Aaron, how about you open it up? So if anybody that's been listening, if you're still hanging in there, God bless you. If you have any questions, fire away.
Yep, just like last week, if you have a question, feel free to unmute your mic.
Sir, if you could, you gave the numbers of the in the 70s of how many people there were and how many in poverty, and then you gave what we have today and how many are in poverty. I didn't put those numbers down. I wonder if I can get them, because I think that's a great example pushing back on the those that say that wealth is limited, and if you get rich, you're doing it off somebody else. So if you give me those
exactly. There's no way you can have 8 billion people living at a higher standard of living than 1 billion people did, and say it's a zero-sum world and we're not making progress. Yeah, in the 70s, it was approximately world population of about 3.5 billion, and about 2 billion were poor. And today we have our 8 billionth person, and we're somewhere a little under 1 billion. We were actually better off, I think, a few years ago, and then COVID happened, and the energy crisis and war and stuff. But we're better off. Those data, if you want to look it up, I wrote an article for the Institute for Faith and Freedom maybe 5 years ago called "Are You Ready for Some Good News?" And so, if you want to, just consult that article. It will give you those numbers and maybe some others. I can't remember everything that's in there. Are you ready for some good news?
Very good, sir.
I am.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
I tuned in hoping to hear a little more bashing on Keynes, and you're stopping short. Any chance you want to take a crack at it?
Well, let me say this about Keynes then. He's revered by his acolytes as some visionary genius or whatever, and that his own version of scientific economics. There's a famous quote from an article he wrote in the early 40s. His basic technique for government intervention, he didn't believe in free markets. He thought that the government needed to get involved and guide or steer a national economy as if a national economy was a real entity. And his main tool is what we call contracyclical actions. In other words, when the economy seemed to be in a recession or was just kind of plugging along weakly, the government should stimulate by deficit spending. But if the economy was overheating, if it was booming too much and maybe prices were rising, well, then maybe the government should reduce spending and even raise taxation on the people. Well, guess what? When real politicians got a hold of that, they love the idea of deficit spending, but they don't turn around then and pay back the deficit as soon as times turn good. That's not the way democratic governments work. And Keynes knew that. This is something that's very little known. In the German translation of his 1935 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in the foreword of the German translation, he says, you know something? This system is better adapted to a totalitarian state. Now, some people think that means that Keynes is a closet Nazi or something. He wasn't. He and Hayek, the free market economy, they're on opposite sides economically. Hayek for the free market, Keynes for government intervention. But they were both on the roofs of Cambridge University, wearing their helmets and guarding against an incoming Nazi bombing raid. So Keynes wasn't a Nazi, but he was being honest enough to describe the practicality of his system. Because in a democracy, it takes months for legislation to get passed. If you were totalitarian, the dictator would just say, okay, raise the taxes tomorrow. Okay, cut government spending, stop that spending tomorrow. In other words, he could pretend to steer the economy more quickly instead of having these sloppy, protracted democratic delays. So, Keynes's system was not the most logistically practical for a democracy. And also, he engaged in mysticism. In this 1940s article, he said, with this contracyclical policy, he said, we have solved the mystery how to turn stones into bread. Oh my goodness. What is he, a biblical prophet or something? He's supposed to be an economist. Here you have Mises, the rigorous scientist and logical thinker, wertfreie economics. And you got Keynes, who's much more popular, spouting nonsense about government intervention is good. When like I said last week, he came out after government intervention had been going on for 5 full years during the Depression. He said, you're doing the right thing with all this deficit spending, big government activism, keep doing it. So he did it for the rest of the 30s, and the Depression continued. It was quackery. And then he has the gall to come out and say, hey, we figured out how to turn stones into bread. You want to follow that guy? I don't. What else? Oh, and some of the more conservative economists would say, well, what about the government deficits? What happens with these deficits in the long run? And here's the famous answer. You've probably heard this one before. Keynes said, well, in the long run, we're all dead, which is very true, but it's not an answer to the question. He was evading it. So, the fact that John Maynard Keynes became the most influential economist in the world and in America in the 20th century is a tragedy, because he just didn't get it. And he wasn't as far off to the left as some. In the early 80s, when I was working on my doctorate, I filled in for a term at one of the other Western colleges in Western Pennsylvania. And I won't name it because I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. But I was one of 8 in the econ department. The others were all radical Keynesians or socialists. So partway through my term there, I go in a friendly young dean of the college, said, Andy, does it seem at all odd to you that your college clientele are the children of the highly successful and prosperous, and you have a college where the economics department teaches them that the system that enabled them, their families, to achieve such great prosperity is corrupt and rotten and worthless? I didn't get invited back to teach there another term. That was not the most diplomatic thing to say, but I'm sharing that with you to show you the state of education in America, that it's all Keynesians and socialists. It's all people that believe in big government, which the government people are the ones that have the power. They're the ones that spend the money. They're the ones that support universities. They're the ones that, subsidize these characters. They're the ones that just make a mess out of everything. They're the ones that buy votes. Politics will always overrule sound economics. Maybe I shouldn't say always. Let's just say it would take one amazing revival, one huge sobering up of people, one colossally vast return to common sense for people to realize, hey, wait a minute, government is not the answer to our economic problems. And I suspect that at some date when the government finds it can't service a 31 or 40, whatever it is at the time, $1 trillion debt, we're all going to go, oops, we kind of goofed there. What scares me is that there's going to be a fork in the road. And the choice is going to be, well, should we go back to what earlier generations of Americans did and fend for ourselves and tell the government just to stay out of the way in terms of economic stuff? Or should we find the new way to depend on government? And I think out of fear, I think a lot of people, and the education they're getting at places other than Grove City College, they've been taught to believe that government's the answer for everything. So they're going to just say, well, okay, we're bankrupt now and the dollar's toast and so on and so forth, but we need more government. We need government to rescue us. Government needs to be our hero. So, just a few random thoughts that were triggered by the invitation to chat a little bit about John Maynard Keynes.
Doctor,
Great
appreciate
lecture.
Go ahead. I'm curious, what is the antidote then to this culture of highly dependent government where the march through the institutions is basically complete?
Well, it's the recovery of the values that we used to live by. What would be the agent of that? Well, one would hope the schools, but most of the schools are lost causes. Grove City is the exception. And another area I would hope would be that there'd be a Christian revival, because the churches need to teach, yes, we should have compassion for each other, but we should not enslave each other in the name of compassion by setting up a grim welfare state where the welfare of people is dependent on these faceless bureaucrats. What lifts people out of poverty is wealth creating, profit-seeking enterprises. That's what has led to advancement in our past. One of the articles that I was going to cite tonight that I wrote, I can't remember the exact title. It might have been two cheers for capitalist exploitation. I know exploitation was somewhere in the title. I wrote this for Faith and Freedom, I don't know, 12, 14 years ago. But it's true that when Andrew Carnegie was making his fortune in the Pittsburgh steel industry, it's true that his workers were paid very little. It was just because of this horribly grim, merciless law of supply and demand. But a few generations later, the American middle class and laborers, blue-collar workers, were enjoying very comfortable standards of living. Why? Because fewer greedy capitalists like Andrew Carnegie were exploiting them? No, because more greedy capital or profit-seeking capitalists were exploiting, were employing them. When you get more businesses, more people, more entrepreneurs with more ideas for how to produce something or provide something that'll increase the welfare of their fellow citizens, they'll need workers, and they'll bid for those workers. So, the answer is more that. And now that I think of it, that article I referred to at the beginning of my talk tonight, that 6-part series on capital, capitalists, and capitalism, I think I make that point in there. So rather than run on here, I'll just refer you to that. Just as a follow-up to that question, what can we do? Let's not be afraid to testify to the truth about our country's good features. The left is negative. The left likes to tear down. The left likes to criticize. The right, I think, we're aware there are challenges. We know that we have to take some steps to make things better. But we have a strong tradition in this country of achieving successes. And we are making progress. And I think we need to salute the areas where we're making progress and make sure young people recognize that, so they don't get poisoned in their minds when they go to some school that tells them that the United States is this inferior society. So it's like Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Let's tell the truth about our country. The truth is, we don't have a perfect country. But compared to what else is in this world, if you've been around, we're pretty good. And that's worth celebrating. And next Thursday night, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, and I hope you can share with your family the thanks, the gratitude you have for the privilege of being an American. It's attached with more challenges today than it is in many years, but we're still free. That means we can do something positive to make it better. Well, we've gone almost 70 minutes. Anybody got a last comment, or should we call it a night? Okay, Aaron, I guess you can shut them down. Hey, thanks, everybody. Bless you all.